Ladies and gentlemen, let me ask you something that might shake you a little. What do you think really happens when you go silent on a man? When the calls stop, the messages disappear, and your name no longer lights up his phone. You think it's nothing. You think he just shrugs it off and moves on. Oh no, you got it all wrong. Because silence is not empty, it's loud. It echoes in places you can't see. It stirs thoughts you didn't plant. It creates emotions you didn't intend. And while you're sitting there thinking, I'll just give it some space, his mind is running a marathon you know nothing about. See, people underestimate what absence does. They think distance is neutral. But distance speaks. Silence speaks. And in a man's mind, it can either build love or quietly destroy it. Silence creates stories. Let me slow this thing down and really talk to you, because this right here, this is where everything begins. When you go silent on a man, you might think you're doing something small. You might think it's just a few hours, or it's just a couple of days, no big deal. But what you don't see is what's happening behind the scenes in his mind. Because a man's mind does not sit still in silence. It moves, it questions, it builds. And the moment communication stops, imagination takes over. See, when there's no information, the brain starts filling in the blanks. That's human nature. And most of the time, it don't fill those blanks with good stuff. It fills them with fear, doubt, and insecurity. So now he's sitting there replaying the last conversation over and over again. He's thinking about what he said, how he said it, what he could have done differently. Did I say something wrong? Was I too much? Did she lose interest? And here's the thing, he might not even show it. He might not text you 10 times asking what's wrong. He might not call your phone trying to figure it out. But internally, oh, it's loud. It's a full conversation happening in his head, and you're not even there to defend yourself in it. That's the dangerous part about silence. It gives his mind permission to create a version of reality that may not even be true. Now let me tell you something else. The longer the silence goes on, the more detailed those stories become. At first, it's just questions. Then those questions turn into assumptions. And those assumptions, they start feeling like facts. Now he ain't asking anymore, did something happen? Now he's telling himself something definitely happened. And once a man convinces himself of a story, it becomes very hard to change that narrative. Because now emotions get attached to it. If the story in his head says you're losing interest, he starts feeling rejected. If the story says there's someone else, he starts feeling replaced. If the story says you don't value him, he starts feeling unimportant. And all of this, all of it, is happening without you saying a single word. That's how powerful silence is. You got to understand, men don't always process emotions by talking them out. A lot of times, they process by thinking it through alone. And when they're alone with no clarity, their thoughts don't just sit quietly. They grow. They expand. They take shape. And not every man has the emotional tools to stop those thoughts from spiraling. So now, instead of him seeing you clearly, he's seeing you through the lens of the story he created. And that version of you might be colder, more distant, less caring than who you really are. But to him, in that moment, it feels real. And once feelings get attached to a false story, reactions start to change. Maybe he pulls back. Maybe he stops reaching out. Maybe he decides to match your silence with his own, not because he stopped caring, but because the story in his mind is telling him he needs to protect himself. That's what people don't realize. Silence doesn't just create confusion. It creates emotional reactions based on imagined truths. Now you've got two people drifting apart, not because of what actually happened, but because of what was never clarified. All it would have taken was a simple message, a quick check-in, a moment of reassurance, but instead silence stepped in and wrote a whole story. And here's the hardest truth of all. Once a story is written in someone's mind, especially one built on emotion, it don't just disappear when you finally speak. Now, you're not just communicating, you're trying to undo everything their mind already decided. And that takes 10 times more effort than just speaking in the first place. So never underestimate what silence does. Because while you're saying nothing, his mind is saying everything. His ego gets tested. Now let's talk about something people don't always like to admit, but it's real. Every man has an ego. And no ego is not always a bad thing. It's what gives a man his sense of pride, his confidence, his drive to show up, to provide, to protect, to feel like he matters. But let me tell you something, that same ego, it can be shaken real quick when silence enters the picture. When you stop reaching out, when the calls slow down, when the messages disappear, a man doesn't just notice it, he feels it. And the first place it hits is his sense of importance. Because in his mind, attention equals value, effort equals interest. And when those things start fading, his ego starts asking questions. Why the change? What did I do? Am I not worth her time anymore? Now understand this, a man may not come to you and say those exact words. He might not sit there and openly admit that it's bothering him. But internally, his ego is taking those hits one by one. Because men are wired to measure their significance by how they are received. When everything was flowing, when the energy was mutual, when the communication was consistent, his ego was in a comfortable place. It told him, you're doing something right. You matter here. But the moment that rhythm breaks, the ego loses its footing. And once that happens, the mind starts trying to protect itself. Now here's where it gets complicated. A wounded ego doesn't always react the same way. Some men will lean in harder. They'll try to fix it, chase it, understand it. They'll double text. They'll check in more. They'll try to regain that connection. Not because they're weak, but because their ego is trying to restore balance, trying to get back to a place where they feel valued again. But other men, they go the opposite direction. They pull back. They get quiet. They act like it doesn't bother them at all. And that's not because it didn't hit them. It's because it hit them deep. See, for some men, showing that something affected them feels like losing control. And the ego doesn't like feeling exposed. So instead of expressing confusion or hurt, it builds a wall. It says, fall back, don't give too much, match the energy. And now what you have is distance growing, not because there's no interest, but because the ego is trying to avoid further damage. You've got to understand, a man's ego is closely tied to respect and recognition. When he feels seen, appreciated, and chosen, his energy expands. He becomes more open, more giving, more invested. But when he feels ignored, overlooked, or uncertain, that same ego starts to contract. And silence creates uncertainty faster than anything else. Because silence doesn't explain itself. It doesn't say, I'm just busy. It doesn't say, I need space. It doesn't say everything is okay. It just leaves a gap. And in that gap, the ego starts making interpretations. Now here's another truth. Once a man's ego starts feeling like it's being tested too much, he begins to question whether the connection is worth maintaining. Not because he doesn't care, but because nobody wants to stay in a space where they feel like they're not enough. And that's where pride steps in. Pride says, don't keep showing up where you're not being met. Pride says, don't keep giving when it's not being returned. So now, even if he misses you, even if he wants to reach out, his ego might stop him. It might tell him to hold back, to stay silent, to protect what's left of his self-respect. And just like that, two people who once had a connection start mirroring each other's silence, not out of peace, but out of pride. That's how powerful this is. It's not just about communication, it's about what communication represents. It represents effort, interest, care. And when those signals disappear, the ego doesn't stay neutral. It reacts sometimes loudly, sometimes quietly, but always deeply. So when you think about silence, don't just think about the absence of words. Think about what it does to a man's sense of self. Think about how it makes him question his place, his value, his role in your life. Because once a man starts feeling like he's not important, his behavior will change, not always because he wants to, but because his ego told him he had to. He starts detaching emotionally. Now let's go deeper, because this right here, this is where things begin to quietly fall apart. When a man starts detaching emotionally, it doesn't happen overnight. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, and most of the time you won't even notice it at first. That's what makes it dangerous, because while everything may look calm on the surface, something is slowly shifting underneath, and it often begins with silence. When communication becomes inconsistent, when effort feels one-sided, when he's left guessing more than he's reassured, a man starts protecting himself. Not in a loud way, not in a confrontational way, but internally, he starts pulling his emotions back little by little, like someone slowly retreating from a place that no longer feels safe. Because let me tell you something, caring without clarity is exhausting. At the beginning, he gives you the benefit of the doubt. He tells himself, maybe she's busy. Maybe something came up. Maybe I'm overthinking. And for a while, he holds on. He stays emotionally invested, hoping things will go back to how they were. But when that silence becomes a pattern, something changes. Hope starts turning into hesitation. Now, before he sends a message, he thinks twice. Before he expresses how he feels, he holds back. Before he opens up, he questions whether it's even worth it. Because every time he reaches out and doesn't feel that same energy in return, it chips away at his willingness to be vulnerable. And vulnerability, for a man, is not something he gives easily. So when he feels like it's not being received, appreciated, or reciprocated, he begins to close that door. Not because he wants to stop caring, but because caring starts to feel like a risk. Now here's where detachment really takes form. He starts creating emotional distance as a form of self-protection. He tells himself, don't expect too much. Don't rely on something that feels uncertain. And slowly, he begins to disconnect from the emotional intensity he once had. The good morning texts become less frequent. The deep conversations become shorter. The excitement he once had when talking to you starts to fade. Not completely at first, but enough to notice if you're paying attention. And here's the truth, he still cares during this stage. That's what makes it complicated. He hasn't fully let go, but he's no longer fully present either. He's in between, half in, half out, trying to balance what he feels with what he's experiencing. Because on one side, his heart is saying, stay, this matters. But on the other side, his mind is saying, protect yourself, this is not consistent. And when those two are in conflict for too long, the mind usually wins. That's when emotional detachment becomes more solid. It's no longer just hesitation, it becomes a habit. He starts getting used to not talking as much. He starts getting used to not sharing everything. He starts getting used to your absence. And once someone gets used to less of you, they start needing less of you. That's a hard truth, but it's real. Because emotions, when not nurtured, don't just stay in place. They either grow or they fade. And silence has a way of slowly draining that emotional connection until there's not much left to hold on to. Now, if you come back at this stage and try to reconnect, you might feel a difference. He's not as open, not as expressive, not as quick to respond emotionally. And it might confuse you because you remember how he used to be. But what you're seeing now is not the man he started as. It's the man who adapted to the situation. He learned to hold back. He learned to expect less. He learned to detach so he wouldn't feel the same uncertainty again. And the hardest part is he didn't detach because he stopped caring. He detached because caring started to hurt. That's what silence can do over time. It doesn't always push someone away immediately. Sometimes it just slowly teaches them how to be okay without the connection they once valued. And once a man reaches that point, rebuilding that emotional closeness takes more than just showing up again. Because now you're not just reconnecting with him. You're trying to reach a version of him that already learned how to live with less of you. His focus shifts. Now let's talk about something that happens quietly, but changes everything. His focus starts to shift. See, a man is naturally wired to direct his energy somewhere. He's not built to just sit still emotionally with unanswered questions, uncertainty, and silence. He needs direction. He needs clarity. He needs something that feels productive, meaningful, or at the very least, reciprocate it. So when you stop reaching out, when your presence becomes inconsistent, when your attention fades, that energy he once gave to you doesn't just disappear. It gets redirected. At first, he doesn't even realize it. He's still thinking about you, still checking his phone, still hoping to hear from you. But over time, as the silence stretches and the connection feels less stable, his mind begins to adjust. He starts telling himself, I can't keep waiting like this. And that's when the shift begins. Instead of wondering why you haven't called, he starts focusing on what he can control. Maybe he throws himself deeper into his work. He stays longer hours, takes on more responsibilities, sets new goals. Not just because he suddenly became more ambitious, but because work gives him something your silence doesn't: structure and results. Work responds. Effort at work pays off. There's no guessing, no emotional confusion. And for a man dealing with uncertainty, that kind of clarity is comforting. Or maybe he turns to his personal goals: fitness, hobbies, self-improvement, things that make him feel like he's moving forward. Because when emotional progress feels blocked, a man will look for progress somewhere else. And let me tell you something important. This shift is not always about replacing you. It's about reclaiming control, because nothing feels more frustrating than investing energy into something that feels unpredictable. So he redirects that energy into places where he knows it won't be wasted. But here's where it gets real. Sometimes that shift doesn't just go toward work or goals. Sometimes it goes toward people, because attention is a human need. Connection is a human need. And if he's not receiving it from you, he may become more open to receiving it from someone else. Not necessarily because he was looking for someone new, but because someone new showed up when you didn't. Someone who replies, someone who checks in, someone who makes him feel seen again. And in that moment, it's not even about comparison, it's about consistency. Because consistency builds comfort, and comfort builds connection. So now, without even planning it, his focus begins to include someone else. Conversations start, energy flows, and what once felt exclusive between you and him now has competition. That's how subtle the shift can be. And the most surprising part, by the time you notice the change, it's already been happening for a while, because a man rarely announces that his focus is shifting. He just shows it through his actions. He becomes less available, less engaged, less emotionally present, not out of spite, but because his attention is no longer centered where it used to be. And attention, once moved, is not always easy to bring back. Now understand this clearly. This doesn't mean he never cared. It doesn't mean the connection wasn't real. It simply means that without reinforcement, without communication, without mutual effort, even the strongest focus can drift, because focus follows value, and value is often felt through presence, effort, and consistency. When those things disappear, the mind starts prioritizing differently. It starts asking, where am I getting something back? Where do I feel progress? Where do I feel acknowledged? And naturally, it leans in that direction. So what started as a small silence turns into a major shift, from you being his main focus to you becoming an afterthought. Not because he woke up one day and decided you didn't matter, but because over time, his attention found a place where it felt like it did. And once a man builds a new routine around a new focus, it becomes part of his daily life. It becomes normal, it becomes comfortable, and breaking that new normal. That takes more than just showing up again. Because now you're not just asking for his attention back. You're competing with everything he learned to focus on in your absence. He questions the connection. Now let's step into a place that most people don't even realize exists until it's too late, the moment a man starts questioning the connection itself. See, in the beginning, everything feels clear. The energy is mutual, the communication is flowing, the interest is obvious. There's no confusion about where things stand because both people are showing up. And when that happens, a man builds a certain belief in his mind. He believes, this is real, this is going somewhere, this means something. But when silence enters the picture, that belief starts to shake, because without communication, clarity disappears. And when clarity disappears, the mind starts searching for answers. A man doesn't like operating in uncertainty for too long. He needs to understand what he's investing his time, his energy, and his emotions into. So when you stop reaching out, when your presence becomes inconsistent, he begins to step back mentally and ask himself questions he never had to ask before. What are we really doing? Where is this going? Is this even real anymore? And those questions are not light, they carry weight, because now he's no longer just feeling the connection, he's analyzing it, and analysis changes everything. When a man starts analyzing instead of feeling, the emotional flow gets interrupted. Instead of enjoying the connection, he starts measuring it. He starts comparing how things used to be with how they are now. He starts noticing the gaps, the inconsistencies, the lack of effort. And once those differences become clear, it's hard to ignore them. Now here's the turning point. He begins to question not just the present, but the past. Was she ever really into me? Did I misunderstand everything? Was it real, or did I just believe it was? That's how deep this goes. Silence doesn't just affect what's happening now, it rewrites what he thought happened before. It makes him doubt moments that once felt genuine. It makes him second-guess emotions that once felt certain. And when a man starts doubting the authenticity of a connection, something inside him starts pulling away, because nobody wants to feel like they built something on a false foundation. Now let me tell you something important. Men don't always walk away immediately when they start questioning things. Sometimes they stay. Sometimes they observe. Sometimes they give it time to see if things correct themselves. But while they're staying physically, mentally they've already started creating distance. They become more reserved. They share less. They invest less emotionally, because in their mind, they're no longer sure if this is something they should fully give themselves to. And that uncertainty creates hesitation. Now, instead of being open, he becomes cautious. Instead of expressing freely, he filters himself. Because once doubt enters the picture, vulnerability feels risky. And a man will not keep exposing his emotions in a space that feels unclear. Over time, those questions become heavier. What if I'm wasting my time? What if I'm the only one who really cared? What if this doesn't lead anywhere? And those thoughts start influencing his decisions. Because at the end of the day, a man wants direction. He wants to feel like what he's building has purpose. He wants to know that his effort is leading somewhere meaningful. But silence removes that sense of direction. It leaves him standing in a place where nothing is confirmed, nothing is denied, and nothing feels stable. And in that kind of environment, the mind doesn't stay patient forever. Eventually, it starts leaning toward conclusions. And those conclusions are often shaped by what's missing, not what's present. If communication is missing, he concludes there's a lack of interest. If effort is missing, he concludes there's a lack of care. If consistency is missing, he concludes there's no real future. And once those conclusions settle in, they become his reality. Now, even if you come back and try to explain, try to reconnect, try to restore what was there, you're no longer building from the same place. Because now you're dealing with someone who has already questioned the foundation, and rebuilding trust in a connection that's been questioned is not easy, because trust isn't just broken by lies. Sometimes it's broken by silence. Sometimes it's broken by the absence of reassurance. Sometimes it's broken by leaving too many questions unanswered for too long. And once a man reaches the point where he's no longer sure what the connection means, he stops holding on to it the same way, not because he didn't value it, but because he no longer understands it. He learns to live without you. Now we've arrived at the stage that most people never see coming, but by the time it happens, it changes everything. This is the point where a man learns to live without you. And let me tell you something, this doesn't happen suddenly. It's not a switch he flips overnight. It's a process, a quiet, gradual adjustment that begins the moment silence becomes consistent and the connection stops feeling alive. At first, your absence feels heavy. He notices it in the little things, the missing messages, the empty notifications, the lack of your presence in his daily routine. He feels it when something happens and you're the first person he would have told, but now he pauses. Because you're not there the way you used to be. And in those early moments, it's uncomfortable. There's a sense of loss, even if nothing was officially ended. There's confusion, even if no explanation was given. And there's a lingering hope that maybe things will go back to how they were. So he waits, maybe not forever, but long enough to see if the silence breaks, long enough to give the situation a chance to correct itself. But as time passes and nothing changes, something inside him begins to shift. He starts adjusting, and adjustment is powerful because human beings have the ability to adapt to almost anything, especially emotional absence. What once felt strange starts becoming familiar. What once felt uncomfortable starts becoming manageable. So now, instead of checking his phone constantly, he checks it less. Instead of expecting a message, he lowers that expectation. Instead of feeling the absence all day, he only feels it in moments, and then even those moments begin to fade. That's how the process works. Little by little, he begins to rebuild his routine without you in it. He fills his time differently. He talks to other people. He invests his energy elsewhere. He finds ways to occupy the space that your presence once filled. Not necessarily because he wanted to replace you, but because empty space doesn't stay empty for long. And here's the truth. At some point, he has a realization, I got through today without her. It's a small thought, but it's powerful. Because the next day it becomes easier, and the day after that even easier, until eventually your absence is no longer something he's constantly aware of. It becomes normal. It becomes part of his new reality. And once something becomes normal, it loses its emotional weight. That's the part people don't think about. They assume that if they come back later, everything will pick up where it left off, that the feelings will still be just as strong, just as available, just as ready. But they don't realize that while they were gone, he was changing. He was learning. He was adapting. He was teaching himself how to exist without relying on that connection. So when you finally reappear, when you decide to reach out again, you might expect the same excitement, the same warmth, the same emotional openness. But what you find instead is someone different. He's calmer, more reserved, less reactive. Not because he doesn't recognize you, but because he no longer depends on you the way he once did, that emotional urgency. It's gone, that constant anticipation. It's faded because he replaced it with stability. He replaced it with self-adjustment. He replaced it with independence from something that once mattered deeply. And here's the hardest truth of all. When a man truly learns to live without you, he doesn't just lose the habit of your presence. He loses the need for it. That doesn't mean he can't care again. That doesn't mean he can't reconnect. But it does mean that you're no longer essential to his emotional balance. And when someone reaches that point, the dynamic changes completely. Now, if he talks to you, it's a choice, not a need. If he engages, it's because he wants to, not because he's waiting. If he gives effort, it's measured, not automatic, because he's already proven to himself that he can move forward without you. And once that belief is established, it's very hard to undo. This is what silence over time can create, not anger, not drama, but distance so deep that it becomes permanent. And by the time you realize it, he's no longer the man who was waiting for you. He's the man who learned how not to. Closing message before silence becomes permanent. So let me leave you with this. Silence is powerful, but not always in the way you think. It doesn't just create space, it creates distance. It doesn't just test feelings, it transforms them. And while you're waiting, thinking time will fix everything. The other person might be learning how to live without you. If it matters, don't leave it unspoken. Because sometimes it's not the mistakes that end something. It's the silence that slowly replaces what used to be there. So speak, show up, be present before absence becomes permanent.